Hello, welcome back. In this video we're going to take a look at receivers. The receiver is, as you may recall, this piece here which goes between your radio transmitter and the flight controller, and it will pass on your instructions to the flight controller to tell it what you are trying to do. And I have a few examples of some receivers here that we can take a look at, and we'll see how they get connected up, and we'll also take a look at how they transmit their information to the flight controller. This is not something that you really, starting to get into the realm of things that you do kind of need to know. But for this video, I'm just going to sort of go over it fairly roughly, and in the future videos we're going to actually have to take a look at more specific details about how these are set up. So as you can tell by looking at these, a receiver will have an antenna, sometimes two antennas, and a kind of a circuit boardy thing like this that will process the radio signal that the antenna picks up and translate that into something that the flight controller can understand. For the receivers that have two antennas like this, it's actually listening to the radio signal on both of these at the same time, and at any given time one of the antennas will usually have a little bit of a stronger signal than the other one, and it continuously switches between them to use whichever one is stronger, and this system is known as diversity. So this one on the left doesn't have any diversity. This diversity can be quite useful on something like a plane or a quadcopter that rotates and turns around as it flies, because that means that sometimes the orientation of one antenna may be in a good position to pick up the signal, but the other one is not. And in that case, diversity is a very handy thing to have, and you can see that this one's actually set up so that these are at 90 degrees. And it turns out that having them at 90 degrees to each other like that is the best way to ensure that whichever way your plane or your quadcopter is facing, you're most likely to get some kind of a decent signal. And speaking of signal, the frequency range that these receivers operate in is most commonly the 2.4 gigahertz range. And if we just have a look at these here, we can see that they are both labeled with 2.4 gigahertz on them there, 2.4, 2.4. And this is the same frequency that is most commonly used for Wi-Fi, like when you connect up your cell phone to a Wi-Fi at home or at work or at school or something. You're probably going to be using a 2.4 gigahertz frequency as well. And the reason for that is that this 2.4 gigahertz band is free to use without any license worldwide. So you're not going to make anybody angry by broadcasting on this frequency. The frequency of a radio transmission is closely related to the range that you're able to get from it. So for 2.4 gigahertz, well, you actually may be familiar with what kind of a range you can get from your Wi-Fi in your house. It's usually sort of around a couple of hundred meters, maybe 300 meters or something like that in a typical case if it's going through walls and things. These receivers here tend to be a little bit more sensitive than that, so they can go quite often a lot more than a few hundred meters. This one over here, I suspect, I haven't actually checked it, but I suspect this may not go more than a few hundred meters. This one I don't know about, and the one in the middle I've actually used this to over 2 kilometers, and it depends on the transmitter as well, but generally we're talking, a few hundred meters or so you can expect from these at least. Now, these modern radio systems like this that we use today have some pretty advanced electronics on them. You can see another little microchip thing on there, and they all have a bunch of microchips on them doing some very fast calculations, which is why we are able to process things and run it to the point where it can understand a 2.4 gigahertz radio signal, which is a very high frequency signal. But back in the day, we used to have lower frequency radios operating in the megahertz range, and they used to have to be carefully managed so that you did not broadcast on the same frequency as somebody else who was flying nearby you. So how is it that these ones can be both on the same frequency? So this is 2.4 gigahertz, this is 2.4 gigahertz, and you can have lots and lots of Wi-Fi access points around your neighborhood, and they all get along without interfering with each other. How does that work? Let's look at this car radio picture to help explain it. You can see that they've tuned their radio to 87.5 megahertz, and they are probably listening to some music while they drive along in their car. And they've got some buttons down here which looks like presets so that you can tune. This one is the 87.5. And there's some other radio stations that they like, and they can push one of these buttons to switch to a different frequency and listen to a different radio station. And this frequency here, as long as nobody else is broadcasting on 87.5, the music will come through nice and clear and there'll be no interference. But if somebody does start up on this broadcasting on the same frequency, it's going to cause some interference and you'll hear both of the radio stations, or you won't hear anything much really, because they'll be sort of all jumbled up together. So you cannot broadcast on the same frequency as somebody else without causing problems. That's one thing to keep in mind. But what if you could switch these buttons quickly enough and you knew that the radio station was going to be changing frequencies? So let's say the radio station's going to broadcast at 87.5 megahertz for 1/100th of a second, and then they're going to switch to, say, 98, and then from 98 they're going to switch to 108, and then they're going to switch to 90, and then they're going to switch to, oh, this is 80. They've got the same number, okay, and then they're going to switch to 106, and you know that the radio station is going to switch frequencies like this in a very specific order, and you know that they're going to do it every 1/100th of a second, and you can push these buttons really fast. You can push these buttons 100 times a second so that you can follow along with the changes in frequency that the radio station is doing. Now, if you could actually do that, you could still hear the music just fine. And the nice thing about that is that if there was another radio station out there that was also doing this frequency hopping around like that, that other radio station and the other person in their car that was pushing these buttons 100 times a second, they would also be able to hear their radio station pretty well most of the time as well. And very, very occasionally, those two radio stations might just collide. So for 1/100th of a second, they might both be broadcasting on 98 megahertz, for example. But it's not going to be very often, especially if you have lots and lots of these channels. There's only 6 here. But if you had, say, 20 of these and you were doing lots and lots of hopping around, the chances of you colliding and broadcasting on the same frequency as somebody else is going to be a very small percentage of the time, and it's going to be only for 1/100th of a second or so. So it's enough that you can still listen to that music fairly well. So this principle is called frequency hopping, as I just mentioned before, and the radios that we use in our these radios here, they do this kind of frequency hopping. So the 2.4 gigahertz refers to like the central frequency, or the general range within which that frequency hopping is going on. And this is a really great thing because you can have hundreds and hundreds of people, as we saw at Flight Fest a while ago, all flying lots and lots of radio control planes all together, and they work just fine. It's a great system. You need to keep in mind, though, that not all transmitters and receivers are compatible with each other. For example, these two on the left are made to work with one of these transmitters, or transmitters that use this protocol that this one uses. And the orange one over here on the right, that is made to use a different radio protocol, so it's not going to work with this transmitter. So usually when you buy a radio like this, you'll find that it comes with a receiver quite often, and in that case you'll be fine. But if you buy extra receivers, you need to make sure you get the right one so that you can use it with your existing transmitter. Okay, so let's have a look at the connections that a receiver has and how they do what they do. So I'm going to look at this one mainly for the rest of the video. I'll come back to that one a little bit later on. I'm not going to come back to this one because they are pretty much the same kind of thing there. As you can see, there's a few rows of pins that are basically the same on the bottom, at least for this one. And the fact that they're in a case like this and this one is not doesn't make any difference. That's just, let's see if I can get this open, we'll have a look at it. They are, of course, just a circuit boardy thing like this. The case just helps to keep them protected if you're going to be crashing a lot or getting dirt in there, and it makes it a little bit easier for you to strap them onto your quad, because you can put a zip tie or something on them nice and tight without worrying about breaking the circuitry on the board. But this one here is obviously made for a purpose. It's intended to be very, very small, so they didn't want to put a box around that one and waste space. Okay, let's have a closer look at this one. We can see that this is a 6-channel receiver, as it says on the side there, and it's powered by from 4 to 8 volts DC. and there are quite a few pins on here. There are 3 rows of 7, or 7 rows of 3 really is a better way to think about it, and they're labelled with each channel, so that's channel 1 through to channel 6, and then we have a 7th set there for B, which stands for bind, and VCC is where we can power it as well. And there's another set of pins for something called ibus, which I'm not sure that I'll look at in this video. We might come to that later. And channel 1 also says ppm on it, and we will look at that in this video. So let me just hold this here, and I'll put a little graphic over the screen to show what this is all about. It may seem like there are a lot of pins on here, but the bottom 2 rows are actually all the same thing. So if I draw a little diagram over the top of it, in black in this case, and notice that I've drawn a little line between them all to signify that these are all connected. And if you open it up and look at the circuit board, you will find that these pins are actually all connected to each other inside, as are the pins on the next row. These are all connected to each other as well. And the top row, these pins are not all connected to each other. These are all individual pins that go to different places on the circuit board. And you may be able to guess from the colors that I've used to draw these that we are looking at ground on the bottom row, and then power, not necessarily 5 volts. Maybe I should have called this just power, because as we saw from the label on the receiver just before, it can take between 4 volts and 8 volts or something like that. But in most use cases we're going to be running this at 5 volts. And then the pins at the top are the signal pins, and they're going to be carrying information coming out of the receiver and into the flight controller or the servos or whatever you want to run this receiver on. And the voltage on these is going to be going up and down in a sort of a pulse, and it's going to be switched between ground or 0 volts and 5 volts, on and off, on and off. So let's have a look at that pulse. So in this next part I have a LiPo battery, and that is connected through a voltage regulator, because this battery is a lot more than 5 volts, but I want 5 volts, so the voltage regulator will bring that down to 5 volts on this side of it, and that's going into the receiver on 2 pins over here. And as we saw before, the bottom 2 rows are all kind of the same, so I could have put these plugs on anywhere along the bottom 2 rows and it wouldn't have mattered. And on the other side I have a ground and a signal. So notice that that one's going into the top row, not the middle, and that is on channel 1. So I'm going to connect my oscilloscope to this point and this point, and we'll measure the voltage difference between these 2 pins. So here's what happens when we do that, and you can see that we're getting a pulse, and this pulse is coming at 50 times per second, and hopefully this is starting to look a little familiar to you already. And if we bring in our radio control, which is turned on of course, and we move the roll stick left and right, we should see that that pulse is changing width. And if we zoom in like we did before, we'll see that when I'm not doing anything, it's about 1500 microseconds. So again, we're 1000 microseconds per square on the graph. And when I put it all the way over to the left, it's about 1000. When I put it all the way to the right, it's about 2000. So hopefully, if you can remember from the previous video, this is exactly the same type of PWM signal that we saw between the servo tester and the servo, or the ESC in that case as well. And it turns out that we can actually, if I just disconnect this plug and plug in a servo to the same place, and now my servo is running off that connection, and I bring this over here, and now I can control my servo in the same way. And the servos of course requires power to run, so what's happening here is that the middle wire is taking its power from that middle rail where all those pins are connected in the middle. So that's how it can power itself. So basically this is the way that you would fly a plane. So on a plane you would have maybe 2 or 3 or 4 servos like this, and they're moving the ailerons and the rudder and stuff like that, and you could connect those all up on different positions in here. So if I take this out of channel 1, so at the moment we've got channel 1 doing that, and channel 2, which is this way, doesn't do anything. But if I put the servo into channel 2, roll does nothing, and pitch is the one that controls it. So each of those channels on the receiver corresponds to one of these directions of movement. And we can also, I think channel 5 is set up to be a switch on here. Let me see which channel does that. So it's on channel 5 at the moment, and I think, yeah. So this switch here is a 3-position switch, and you can see it works in kind of the same way. So when it's in the middle, it'll be giving that 1500 microsecond pulse. When it's at the top, it'll be, I'm not sure, yeah, there'll be 2000, I think, 1500, 1000. So it's basically the same kind of signal, it's just that it only has specific positions where it will stop instead of being a smooth range like these joysticks are. But of course quadcopters don't have any servos. What we wanted to use this for is to talk to the flight controller like this. So we can use one of these servo cables to connect the receiver and the flight controller. So there's no servos here, but we tend to call these cables servo cables for the reasons that I've just shown you. And it's got 3 wires, and we're going to connect ground and 5 volts and the signal. And I'm going to put this into the let's see, was it channel 6 or channel 5? Oops. And because we've got power coming through there, that will be a nice convenient way to power the flight controller for us too. And if I switch my switch now, this other switch, you'll see that the receiver is sending this information about the switch position through to the flight controller, and at the moment it's set up to change a flight mode, which also happens to change one of those LEDs. So you can see the red LED is on there, and when I flip it like that, it beeps and it turns it off. So the flight controller is able to read this kind of PWM signal. So if we wanted to use this type of PWM signal to fly the quadcopter, we would need to have one of these sets of 3 wires for every channel that we wanted to control. And we're going to have 4 channels because we've got 2 channels on here and we've got 2 channels on here, so we need at least 4. And then we're probably going to want to switch flight modes like this. So in reality we want at least 5 channels, maybe even more. So what that means is that if we wanted to use this type of PWM communication, we're going to need lots and lots of wires. We're going to need 5 wires coming, or 5 sets of wires, 15 wires in total, coming from here to here, and that clutters things up quite a lot. And it's sort of, we're using the old-fashioned way of doing things, the way that servos would have worked, because on a plane you do actually need to have separate wires going to each servo, so it was necessary to do this. But with quadcopters, where we just have one thing talking to another one thing, having 15 wires between just these 2 things is kind of silly. So we have come up with other ways to do it, and that's what the PPM label was on, that is on here. That was what that is about. So we'll have a look at PPM now and see how that works. Okay, so I've connected up my oscilloscope again to channel 1, and channel 1 is the one that was also labeled with PPM. So I have to use this particular channel on this receiver to get PPM output. And as before, we have this single pulse, which is coming 50 times per second, and when I move my stick we can see it's getting wider and narrower. Let me just zoom in a bit like that. Okay, so this is the 1000 microsecond to 2000 microsecond normal, we'll call this normal PWM pulse. And in my transmitter here I have a menu which lets me change PPM. At the moment it says PPM output off, but if I turn that to on, we'll see that now we get a very different kind of a signal. And I have to change the setting here so that we can get that to sit still so that we can look at it. And we'll see that instead of oh well, we need to do this now, don't we? See what happens there? When I change this, we get roll, as I had before. We also get pitch. And over here we have throttle and yaw. And something's moving around there, and I should be able to do these as well. So these are all affecting the output on the oscilloscope. So what's happening in effect here is I've got all my channels that I want coming through just this one wire, which is much more convenient when all you're trying to do is connect two individual circuit boardy things. So this is called ppm, and the reason it's called ppm is that instead of measuring the width of the pulse like pulse width modulation does, this is actually measuring the position of the pulse. And you'll see that if I zoom in just a bit more, so I'm going to be moving the roll stick like that. The way this works is it's kind of a width still, but it's measuring the difference between, I think if I get this right, it's measuring the difference between this point and that point. So when I move it, everything behind that has to shift over as well. So anyway, that's probably all we need to look at for ppm. The point to remember is that you need to change the settings. You might need to change the settings for this particular radio and this particular receiver. You will need to come into the menu and make a change. Some receivers, such as this one, I think this one does it. It's actually a little bit worn off, I can't remember, but I think this one had a dedicated pin that was always going to be outputting ppm. And on this receiver, let's come back to this one now, we have a reason to look at this again. If I turn this one over, we'll see that it actually has ppm on it. And that makes sense because we don't have any of those like rows and rows of pins like this other receiver has. So we're going to have to use just a single wire to connect this one. And those labels there are referring to the pins on the other side. There's not much room on this receiver to print things, I guess, so they had to print it on the back. And you can see there ground and 5 volts ppm that you would use to solder up those. So it's a little bit more of an advanced connection on this one. Actually, there is one other thing about ppm that I should mention while we're doing this. In addition to getting all of your channels on one wire, in this particular case for this receiver we actually get more channels because if we're using normal PWM, we are restricted to however many pins we have on here, which is in this case 6. So that's why it calls itself a 6-channel receiver. But if you look at the number of pulses there, we actually have 9, well there's 9 dips down, which it gives us 8 channels. So I'm only using 6 at the moment, but in theory we could set this up so that we have the 4 channels for my joysticks, and then I have 2 channels for these switches and 2 channels for the dials, or maybe 4 switches or something. So you can arrange it to use whichever of these controls you feel that you want to use, and ppm will allow you to do that for 8 channels instead of 6 for this receiver. So it's quite a nice advantage. Some receivers already come with more than 6 pins, so you can buy one of these that's I think it's an FSIA10B or something like that, and it has 10 pins actually, so you can use 10 pins using normal PWM if you want to. But for this one, going from 6 channels to 8 channels by using ppm is a nice advantage. So now that we know how PWM and ppm protocols work, there's just one other thing I wanted to look at in this video, and that is this thing that we saw a couple of times while we were looking at things, and that's at the top where it says ibus. And also on here we had mention of ibus in the green part at the top there. See, it says ibus. And this is another method of communication that can be used to send information from the receiver to the flight controller using just one wire. And it's a pretty complicated thing perhaps to try and understand. It's certainly a little bit tricky to explain. In fact, I almost didn't do this part, and you really don't need to know how the details of this all fit together. But suffice to say that ibus is what's known as a serial connection, and it allows you to communicate information faster from the receiver to the flight controller, and it also is able to handle much more sophisticated information, so not just simply the positions of the channels like we have with PPM here. You can also send a variety of other information through this type of connection as well. And ibus is just one of many types of serial connection. So ibus is the one that this company that makes this thing, FlySky, they make this thing called ibus, and you may have actually heard by this point of something called S-bus, which is probably a little bit more popular, which is made by a different company called FrSky, and they use that on their transmitters. The principle is the same, but they are not compatible. That's the main point at this point. So let's just look at some limitations of PPM, and then maybe we can understand a bit more about why we might want to have a serial connection. So this is the PPM pulse here, and we've got our 8 pulses going up and down. And remember, the way that we communicate here is by measuring the time between these pulses starting and stopping. So this requires that the sending side, the receiver in this case, and the receiving side, the flight controller, sounds a bit backwards, doesn't it? The receiver's sending and the flight controller's receiving. But anyway, the sender and the receiver they need to have an accurate clock, because the receiving side of this signal is waiting for this pulse to go down, and then it starts a timer, and then when the pulse comes up again, or actually it might be this other one that goes down, it's waiting for the second one to go down, I think, there. So it counts up how many microseconds have passed between this point and that point. So it can happen that the clock on this side and the clock on the receiving side are not running at exactly the same rate, so you won't get exactly the same number coming out the other end of the transmission. So that's one limitation. In this case, it's not a big deal, because all we're trying to do is transmit the position of the stick, and it's not a huge deal if it's just a tiny little bit off. That's usually okay. Another limitation of PPM is, because we are measuring things with time, in order to get, say, 8 channels, we are constrained to waiting a specific amount of time from the beginning of this point to the end of that point. We can't get around having to wait a certain amount of time, because that's how it works. And we also have to put a decent amount of time in between these sets of pulses. So if I zoom out a bit, we have sets of pulses coming in like that, and we have to separate them by some time. Otherwise, all the sets of pulses will get mixed up, and we won't know where one of them starts and where it finishes. And when we do that, you can see 10 milliseconds here, and we've got from there to there. So it's 20 milliseconds between sets of pulses. In other words, 50 times per second that we're going to have our instructions relayed to the flight controller. So what that means is, when we move our stick around, 50 times per second, the flight controller is going to get it's going to get an update on what we're doing. And it turns out that these processors can actually do things quite a bit faster than that if they're using the right methods. So let's take a look at what an ibus signal looks like. So I'm going to remove this from the PPM plug, and I'm going to put it into the ibus. In this case, I'm going to use the servo, the one that's labeled servo, so it's using the horizontal set of pins at the top. Servo implies that this is information coming out of the receiver, and this other one is sense, short for sensor. So this is actually, you can use this to read information from other sensors on the quadcopter and feed it back to the transmitter on the ground, so you can get some information about what's going on. Usually the battery voltage is the main thing that you're interested in. Anyway, but we can see at the background it changed there, and now we can see again we have sets of pulses, but they are not separated by 20 milliseconds anymore. They are separated by so now each square is 2 milliseconds, and we've got about 4 squares, almost 4 squares. So it's about 8 milliseconds between sets of pulses, which is more than twice as fast as what we were running before, meaning that when you make a stick movement, this will be around about 120 times per second, your stick movements are going to be updated in the flight controller. So immediately we can see that we're going to get a faster response time when we move. And with the speed that these quadcopters can move, you really want to have a nice response time when you're trying to control it. So that's one advantage of a serial connection, ibus in this case. Now if we zoom in on these, we'll see they're really quite dense. We have to zoom in quite a bit more to see what this pulse looks like. Let's go back to about here. And this is a bit more sort of random looking. It's not very uniform like we saw in those other pulses. And that's because this is actually transmitting some binary information. So without trying to... I'll try and explain it, shall I? So the way this works is that instead of the receiving side waiting for the pulse to go low and then measuring the time that it takes for the next pulse to come in, which is, if we look at this as, use the analogy of you standing on one side of the room and your friend standing on the other side of the room again, like I had in one of those other videos before, we could imagine that this pulse going high and low is that you have a flashlight and you are turning it off and on. And the way that PPM works was, when your friend sees the flashlight turn on, he will start a stopwatch, and then when he sees the light turn off, he'll look at how much time has passed. So that's how PPM works, and that's why it's not quite accurate if your friend's stopwatch is running a little bit different, or he pushes the button a little bit too slow. The number that you put in is not going to be exactly what he gets out. But the way serial works is you can actually get exactly the number in that you put out, but it requires this binary protocol. So imagine that we start off with the light is on. So you have the light on when nothing's happening, like this. And then you turn the light off. And this is a signal to your friend that you are about to start turning the light off and on at a certain specific time interval. So he can close his eyes for a specific time, and then he's just going to briefly open his eyes and see if you have the light on or not. So say every 1 second he opens his eyes to see if you have the light on, just quickly, and then he closes his eyes again, and he does that 8 times. And if the light's off, he'll say that's a 0. If the light's on, he'll say that's a 1. And when he has 8 zeros and 1s, or whatever they are, in this case it looks like 4 zeros, 1 1, another 0, and then 2 1s. So I'm just sort of roughly looking at this here, but these short pulses seem to be about the width of one of these sort of intervals, and it looks like we have about 4 of them there, and then there's one that's on, one that's off, and then 2 that are on. So if you were to look at this as a binary number, it might be 0 0 0 0 1 0 1 1, and in binary that would be 1 plus 2 is 3 plus 8 is 11, would it be? I think that would be 11. I don't know if this is exactly how it works. The ordering might be the other way around. But the point is, with this protocol, the number that you tried to send to your friend is going to be exactly the number that he gets. So it's more accurate and it's faster. And it's much more flexible because you can send other types of information. And we may look in a future video about connecting up a sensor here so that the receiver can actually send some information back to the transmitter, and in which case we'll be able to see some information sent back here. Actually, right now we can see some information sent back here. We have an error percentage, and it says 0% errors, which means that obviously because we're so close here, there's no problem in transmitting the signal. But as you get further away, or you get obstructions in between you and the quadcopter, you'll see this number going from 0 up to something higher than 0. Hopefully not to 100%, because then you've lost contact completely. Alright, well, as usual, there is still plenty more to say about this stuff, but after that explanation of ibus, I think most people will probably be fast asleep by now, so I think I'll just finish for now, and we'll look a bit more in detail about actually using this and configuring it with the flight controller in a future video. Anyway, for now, thanks for watching. See you next time.